Okay, let's take a look at policy framework for Zscaler private access. I'm going to start with the Client Connector portal. So we'll log into our Client Connector portal and take a look at some of the definitions and resources available to us there, which feed into the ability to use these in Zscaler private access. So first off, under administration, we have service entitlement. So based on the groups the user is a member of, we might decide whether to enable ZPA or not. So I only want ZPA available for users that are in this group. So when the user authenticates to Zscaler Internet Access, that will provide them a group, and that group is sent to the mobile admin portal, and the mobile admin portal makes a decision: do I continue and enroll the user in Zscaler private access? So a criteria for even getting Zscaler private access enabled is the group that you are a member of. So make decisions here for that. Device posture gives me the ability to fingerprint processes, information about the endpoint that I can then use as criteria within Zscaler private access and Zscaler internet access. So if I come out of here and I'll look specifically at a Mac OS device, we can look at a number of different things here. We can say certificate trust is a file path. Well, let's go through these. So I can look at certificate trust and I can upload a certificate, and we're saying, does the machine trust this certificate? So you might put your internal root certificate authority in there, or an intermediate certificate authority that is issued somewhere to the device. A file path, I'm looking for /opt/zscaler/var, for example, on my Mac, file.txt. Does this file exist on the machine? Client certificate is an extension of the certificate trust, and it's saying, is there a client certificate on the machine? And then is it issued by a specific CA? So I upload the certificate authority here, and is there a certificate which is issued by that certificate authority? I can then perform a certificate revocation list check. So I will query the CRL endpoint, I will download the certificate revocation list, and I will compare the serial numbers of those certificates for whether or not the certificate has been revoked. And then I can also say that the certificate needs to have a non-exportable private key. So when this certificate was enrolled, the certificate private key was encrypted on the machine, marked non-exportable, or had a password protection on it, that then I can then say, this device is secure, this certificate is secure, it hasn't just been copied arbitrarily from one machine to the other. I can also look for the Mac firewall. And I can also look for disk encryption being enabled. If I come across to the Windows, I have I have a few more options available. So I can look for, is the device domain joined? WelshGeek.net. And we'll look for the registry information to tell us that it's domain joined. We'll look for a process. We'll say, it's C:\program files. iExplore.exe. Is this running? And is there a signer certificate, or is the process signed by a digital certificate, and we upload the thumbprint of that certificate? So even if the file changes, the thumbprint will remain for the signer certificate. We can look whether or not Carbon Black is running. We can look whether or not CrowdStrike is running. We can look for Sentinel-1. And we can say, what does the CrowdStrike ZTA score tell us and it's got to be a minimum of 70 for that process check to pass. We can look for Microsoft Defender to be running. We can say we want a AV running, my AV engine, and check the definitions are up to date. And we can say a minimum version of Windows to be running, for example, and we could say Windows 11 Education, and we can say Windows 11 Workstation. So we can say multiple versions of Windows to be running. All those things together, OS version, we can select save, and all those things are true. So we've now got a definition that we can use in our ZPA policy. We also have our trusted networks, what defines me being in the data center, what defines me being in the branch. So we come out of this, we come back to the private access dashboard. Let's also look at our IDP information. So I have my IDP configured for Azure. I previously imported my SAML attributes. We show the SAML attributes. These are the attributes that come back as part of the SAML assertion. So these are user attributes, the display name, the groups I'm a member of, the department, what Azure tenant ID, information about my object ID, auth references is how did I authenticate, and what is the identity provider information. These other information is compliant, is managed, is known, is returned to me by, in this case, Azure, but is returned by other device. These other attributes is compliant, is managed, is known, are returned to me by Azure AD and tells me whether or not the device is corporately managed, corporately owned, it's domain joined as part of Azure AD, and it's passed the conditional access policy. And so if those things are true, those can be returned to us as SAML assertions through the authentication round that we can then apply policy on. So we can come in here, we can go to the IDP again. Let's run that SAML import check, and you can see the result of those attributes coming across as part of this. Let's Ryan at welshgeek.net. So we can come over to the IDP configuration. We can click import. It'll do the SAML authentication. So we come over to the IDP configuration page, we can import the SAML attributes, and we can look at those attributes that come across to the device. In this case, it tells me the information. I didn't pass any of those management attributes because I'm on an unmanaged Mac device, whereas if I did it for my Windows device, I would get that is managed, is compliant, is known attributes returned. And it tells me which groups I'm a member of, all the other information. I can also take a look at my SCIM attributes. So these have come across through SCIM sync, a bunch of attributes that could be sent across. If I look at my users, it's sent across a number of users to me here. I can search here for a user. So mRyan here has been synchronized. I've got the GUID for the user, and I've got the information on the username. If I take a look at the SCIM groups, we know that Mark is a member of a group called ZPA enabled, but if we take a look here and we filter for mRyan at welshgeek.net and click update, we can say it's also synchronized across other groups that Mark is a member using the SCIM. So he's in Internet ZPA enabled, but he's also in private access all, certificate auth. So I have a database here telling me both the SCIM information and the SCIM groups, and then I have my SAML assertion, which is presented as part of that authentication request. So all of these resources combined with my device posture and application segments I can use in policy. So let's finally take a look at the application segments. I've got my application segments defined here. I've got inspection enabled for my Apache application. I've got browser-based access. I might have some privileged remote access configured as well. So let's take a look first at the access policy. So my access policy starts that I have Zscaler deception enabled. It's an uneditable rule for my deception traffic. And I have an allow all rule for everything else. So everybody can access everything is probably not an ideal solution to be part of, but it is generally where we start when we're starting to move from VPN, which gives you network-based access where everybody can access everything. So we can add a rule. Let's just call this rule number 1, and we'll give it a description. And we have a number of criteria we can look at. So we can apply policy based on the applications. So I can select specific applications, my Apache server, or a group, which is my browser group, and then this rule will trigger on this, and I can say allow access to everybody accessing those. But I could also add a criteria that says I want to only allow access when that posture profile for that OS has been verified. And I might also say if I had other posture profiles that they also need to be true. Or I might change that to an and say I need the OS posture check and the AV to be running for that posture to be true. So having multiple posture profiles defined, I can then and them together in my criteria. So add another criteria for trusted networks. So again, it's anded together, and the trusted network needs to be data center, or I could say branch. So these are ORed together. And I could add another criteria for the client types. Again, my client types, I could say I want this rule to trigger for the web browsers, my cloud browser, my isolated browsers, devices coming from a machine tunnel. If it's being forwarded from Zscaler Internet Access, so the ZIA to ZPA forwarding, I can select here, and I might have my client connectors, ZCC, or I can make a decision where it's been forwarded from the Zscaler Cloud Connector, where we're doing workload to workload connectivity. Again, criteria, I could say Cloud Connector groups. If I was doing that Cloud Connector forwarding from workload to workload, I have those defined. That is outside the scope of this course. Or we could also say the machine groups, and the machine group is those machine tunnels for pre-Windows logon. And then finally, I can do policy based on SAML or SCIM attributes. So my SAML and SCIM attributes, I select my IDP, I select whether I want to do it on SAML attributes. So my SAML attribute list that I know about, I could say department, and then I enter sales. I could add more, and I could AND or all these together. So again, SAML attribute department is networking. So again, the user is in networking or sales. The user can't be in two departments because it's a single value attribute. I could then say other things. I could say a skim attribute. So a user attribute is active, and it has to be true. Or I could say the department from skim is sales. So again, all these attributes together, those might be ANDed together. So that doesn't really make sense for departments, but we'll keep these as ORed. Or we could say a skim group attribute, and the skim group has to be Zscaler ZPA enabled. So I can concatenate any number of rules together to then make a decision to allow or block access. If I allow access, then Zscaler private access is going to make a decision to A, allow access, but B, select the path to steer that traffic through to the application. So I have an additional option here. Based on these criteria, I can either say consider all app connectors or specific app connector groups based on this policy. So I might say I specifically only want to use the Milton Keynes data center when this rule triggers. And this is going to be context based, based upon where your application is and where your users are. But we have a rich policy here to allow or deny access, and if we allow access, which path to use. Take a look at the timeout policy. Timeout policy dictates the frequency of authentication. So by default, we can make a decision. Should users re-authenticate? In this case, I wanted them to re-authenticate every 1 day. But I might say, actually, I only want to authenticate users once a year, for example. And this applies to all users. But I may say, let's take a consideration of Apache. I actually want to say the authentication timeout is 8 hours. And then I say the application criteria, application segment is Apache. And so what that would mean is that when I go to access Apache, if I haven't authenticated to ZPA in the last 8 hours, I'd be prompted to re-authenticate. I'd still be able to access all other applications, but I couldn't access Apache until I'd re-authenticated within the last 8 hours. Again, I can do this based on client types, posture, and SAML attributes. So I might say anybody in the sales department needs to re-authenticate every 8 hours to Apache, but anybody in finance can re-authenticate within the last 30 days. When that triggers, I make a decision whether I terminate existing sessions. So in that example, if I was a user in sales accessing the Apache website and then my 8-hour timeout hit, I would be prompted to re-authenticate, and if this is enabled, existing sessions would be terminated. Or I might say continue to allow existing sessions, but any new sessions need to be re-authenticated. The client forwarding policy makes a decision which applications get downloaded to the client. So consider I've defined 8 applications in my application segments here. Well, that's probably more like 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got my 10 applications defined here. A client would download all of these and those definitions are available. But actually, from a pure zero trust framework, actually once I've started to define these applications, a user should only get the definitions of the applications they're approved to authenticate or access. So I might make a client forwarding policy, and that says only forward allowed applications. So in that case, we will evaluate the SAML and SCIM attributes for that access policy, and whichever application the user is allowed access to, those are the applications they get downloaded. I might make a decision to specifically bypass an application definition for a user or a transaction, or I might make a decision to only forward specific applications to specific users. So again, I can do this based on, again, those applications, the trusted networks, the client types, SAML and SCIM attributes. But really what I'm defining here is which FQDNs and which wildcards get downloaded to the machine. So as an example, if I only downloaded the wildcard, then anytime the user tried to DNS resolve, they might get that synthetic IP, but they'd get blocked by policy when they connected to it. Or I might make a decision, only allow them to download this one application segment, apache.welshgeek.net, and they don't get any other definitions, therefore they wouldn't be able to resolve, let alone attempt to connect to any other application. The isolation policy makes a decision how to isolate and when to isolate access. So again, I can add a rule. The actions are either to allow isolation to a specific isolation profile, or to bypass isolation if you have this in that ordered list, top-down first match. You'll see that the client type has to be a browser, and then I can write my applications and SAML SCIM attributes to make a decision to isolate the user for those transaction types. And then my inspection policy, again, if I make a rule, I can say for my application that has inspection enabled, which is Apache, it should inspect, and which inspection profile that was previously defined is going to be used for that transaction. Again, I can write policy based on SAML attributes and client types for each of those.